Hello everyone, my name is Janus Evans D. Rosilio and the following video is my final evangelization output for my Religious Education 3 class, Our Restless Hearts and Introduction to Catholic Moral Theology. Please enjoy the video and God be with you. So what is this paper all about? This paper explores my personal notion of happiness. Firstly, I'm going to provide a brief discussion concerning the definition of happiness and then the different ways it is acquired by an individual. Most importantly, provided in the following paragraph is the discussion about immediate gratification and competitiveness as means to achieve happiness benefiting the lives of other people rather than causing harm to oneself and others in society. Secondly, I'm going to provide an analogy of my personal notion of happiness before discussing their underlying relationship. Thirdly, I'm going to provide a discussion about how my personal notion of happiness can be put into effect in real life. Fourthly, I'm going to provide the relationship between my personal notion of happiness and Catholic moral theology. Lastly, I'm going to provide a reflection concerning my personal notion of happiness. So what is my personal notion of happiness? Happiness is the feeling of pleasure or contentment a person acquires from doing something that he or she thinks is right. Therefore, happiness can be obtained in many different ways. Happiness can be obtained through philanthropy. In other words, happiness can be obtained by helping others or benefiting humanity. Nonetheless, a person can also obtain happiness at the expense of other people. Minimally, this kind of happiness equals to victory in a competition. Ultimately, on the other hand, a person may adversely affect the lives of other people to obtain his or her own happiness. For instance, a person may not just want an undesirable circumstance to occur from other people, but also act upon it to obtain his or her own happiness. Moreover, a person can also negatively obtain his or her own happiness through binge indulgence. In other words, a person can obtain his or her own happiness through an unrestrained act and behavior. For instance, a person's unrestrained and excessive drinking of alcohol and consumption of food. In my point of view, a person should predominantly obtain his or her own happiness through helping others. However, he or she should retain a minimal competitive lifestyle and occasionally indulge in activities that provide immediate gratification. A competitive lifestyle and seeking immediate gratification are not inherently evil. Humans, after all, have a material or temporal aspect that gives them the ability to feel the environment and interact with other people and other living creatures. Thus, we need to satisfy the basic pleasures like food and drink. Likewise, competitiveness is not inherently evil. In democratic societies, everyone is equally provided the opportunity to transcend from their social circumstances through education, especially the marginalized, and acquire higher levels of achievement. Incidentally, learners and professionals are expected to exert effort and qualitative work, thus resulting to competition. Therefore, the purpose of competitiveness and acquiring immediate gratification should be about attaining happiness by contributing to society. In other words, a person's competitive drive and acquisition for immediate gratification should ultimately benefit the lives of other people. I believe that a person can help more people if his or her underlying reasons for competitiveness and desire for immediate gratification is altruistic in character. For instance, an individual's reason to maintain a healthy lifestyle through eating nutritious food and drink is to have more time in doing charitable work. Or a person could simultaneously help others while doing his or her best in school. Similar to the story of the newspaper vendor in Bill Gates' interview about doing charitable work despite a person's financial circumstances. However, we should not overlook the adverse consequences that might manifest from competitiveness and desire for immediate gratification, even if their purpose is to help others. For instance, if the desire for immediate gratification has become gluttonous in character, that in particular through heavy drinking and overeating, that they become harmful to themselves, then he or she is acquiring his or her own happiness in a negative way and is no longer contributive to society. Likewise, once competitiveness results to envy and contempt, then that person is no longer contributive to society and is acquiring his or her own happiness in a negative way. So I'm now going to provide my analogy for my personal notion of happiness. My personal notion of happiness is similar to wealth. According to the 16th century Spanish novelist Miguel de Cervantes, the gratification of wealth is not found in more possession or in lavish expenditure, but on its wise application. In other words, the satisfaction that comes from wealth is not acquired through the acquisition of more wealth, but to its wise application. Thus, this brings us to the 19th century Scottish-American industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie that said, "Surplus wealth is a sacred trust, which its possessor is bound to administer in his lifetime for the good of the community. Therefore, the wise application of wealth must relate for the benefit of the community." This reflects to my personal notion of happiness that it must derive from altruistic work. Our happiness must come from helping the community, especially the poor and the marginalized in society. Unless competition and acquisition of immediate gratification are perceived as means for the benefit of the community, they are self-serving and harmful to the person and disadvantageous for others. There are two underlying reasons for my analogy about my personal notion of happiness. Firstly, unlike the satisfaction that comes from wealth through its wise application, my personal notion of happiness is about diverting the purpose of a person's competitive drive and desire for immediate gratification to acquire happiness through altruistic work. In other words, the reason a person should provide the best of his or her capabilities and compete with other people is for him or her to expand their charitable work to the poor and the disadvantaged. Meanwhile, the reason a person should satisfy his or her basic needs, such as food and drink, is for them to have more energy in helping people. Secondly, similar to the wealth that it must relate for the benefit of the community, our happiness should emanate from the well-being of others. We can achieve happiness through different means, particularly through winning in a competition, enjoying food, and buying expensive luxuries. Unless such acts could become possible means to achieve happiness through helping others, they do not substantially benefit the lives of other people, especially the poor and the neglected in society. So, how can I put into effect my personal notion of happiness? In general, my personal notion of happiness is about its achievement through altruistic work. In other words, happiness should emanate from helping other people, despite our financial circumstances or other problems that we are facing in life. Moreover, the underlying reason a person should live his or her life is for them to help other people. Therefore, a person's desire for immediate gratification and competitive quality should be beneficial for society. My personal notion of happiness can be actualized through the following. Firstly, the reason a person should acquire goods that provide immediate gratification is for him or her to have the energy to help other people. For instance, the reason a person should buy nutritional products despite their prices is so that he or she have enough energy to do charitable work, such as participating in community projects and visiting the elderly or the orphanage to do charitable work. Secondly, the reason a person should have a competitive quality is for him or her to help more people in the future. Of course, this is not an excuse for anyone to currently disregard helping other people. Therefore, he or she should simultaneously learn to appreciate helping others, even at a minimal level, and try his or her best to be qualitative in life. For instance, the story of the newspaper vendor in Bill Gates' interview about doing charitable work, despite the possibility that the former may lose substantial income. Another example concerns the parables of the prodigal son, when the father did not hesitate to slaughter a top-quality livestock to celebrate the return of his younger son, prioritizing generosity over competitiveness. Thirdly, another way a person can put forth my personal notion of happiness is in real life is for him or her to help the natural environment through the financial assistance of their or direct participation, such as planting trees or properly disposing garbage. Helping others is not necessarily direct. We can help others by changing the circumstances of the natural environment. Lastly, another way a person can put forth my personal notion of happiness in real life is for him or her to teach children and adults that cannot even afford to enter educational institutions out of their social circumstances, such as street children and street dwellers in society. Of course, we cannot teach something valuable to others if we do not know ourselves what we are teaching with clarity. Academic institutions provide us an opportunity to develop our knowledge. However, we also have a role to play by doing our best in schools, thus necessitating competitiveness. So, how is my personal notion of happiness relevant to morality and practical life? Firstly, I'm going to provide the context of Catholic morality. Fundamental moral theology is a branch of Catholic theology that deals with avoiding evil or sin and making morally sound judgment. Sin is the rejection of God and refusal to follow in our own conscience call towards the good. According to the theologian James Keenan, sin is the failure to bother to love and perceive oneself in a relativist view of being better than others. Moreover, sin is not just harmful to the person committing it but also affects the lives of other people. The only way an individual can break away from sin and be in communion with God is through grace. It allows the individual to become free to love and serve others and choose to do what is right amidst all the poverty and injustices in the world. In sacred scripture, mercy provides meaning to morality. Technically, mercy is defined as the kindness or forgiveness shown by a person to another. Moreover, it is the willingness of a person to enter into the chaos of another and accompanying the latter in his or her journey. In the New Testament, mercy is important in the Beatitudes. It is the synthesis of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It is defined as a set of values and attitudes that are known as Jesus' way to true happiness and towards finding true meaning in life. In the New Testament, Jesus sought out to include the following back in the community and allow them once again to participate in society: the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the tax collector, the prostitute, and ultimately the poor. It is through the poor and the marginalized that the Catholic Church believes that we will meet Jesus, as for Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." In other words, as Catholics, understanding the lives of those that are suffering would reflect our understanding of the world around us. So now I'm going to provide the relationship between Catholic moral theology and my personal notion of happiness. Based on my understanding of the context that surrounds Catholic moral theology, the following are the main thoughts that provide the relationship between morality and my personal notion of happiness. Firstly, unless a person's desire for immediate gratification and competitiveness benefits the lives of other people, they are self-serving and disadvantageous for other people. In other words, the reason a person should start his or her meal and be diligent in their studies is for them to help more people in the future. Otherwise, the future that they will establish for themselves are self-serving and disadvantageous to society. Thus, my personal notion of happiness reflects an individual's morally sound judgment to avoid or break away from sin and be in communion with God through grace by compassionately serving the community to achieve happiness. Secondly, my personal notion of happiness stresses a person's avoidance in subjectively viewing themselves that they are better than others. This is highly common in competitive individuals and may adversely affect the lives of other people. The happiness that comes from winning causes them to be delusional that they are better than others. My notion of happiness stresses the ultimate goal of helping others to achieve happiness. Therefore, the happiness that comes from winning should not lead a person astray on his or her ultimate goal. Thirdly, my personal notion of happiness reflects on Christ's Beatitudes due to the following. My personal notion of happiness shows poor in spirit since it recognizes that every blessing comes from God and thus should be shared with others. It shows sorrowfulness since it understands the harmful effects of sin between oneself and others. It shows hunger and thirst for holiness since it values the charity work provided to others in serving God. It shows mercifulness since it stresses its sympathy to those that are suffering in our world. Lastly, it shows pure-heartedness since it emanates from one's unselfish and unconditional love for others. Lastly, my personal notion of happiness reflects some of the proposed beatitudes of Pope Francis because it perceives God in every person and puts effort at those in our society that are abandoned and marginalized. Moreover, my personal notion of happiness understands that a person has to renounce his or her comfort in order to help other people. I am now going to discuss about my reflection in regards to my personal notion of happiness. As a Catholic Christian, my personal notion of happiness is an ideal way of living. I recognize that I have committed innumerable sins in life, thus I am no different from most people in the Christian Catholic community. Concerning my personal notion of happiness, I have to confess that I deviate most of the time from fulfilling my ultimate goal of helping the community and following the teachings of Christ. For instance, I allow myself to be consumed with the evils that emanate from immediate gratification and competitiveness. In particular, I occasionally disregard whether I am committing glutinous acts through overeating and excessive drinking alcoholic beverages, especially in parties and events. Moreover, as a student, I have to admit that most of the time I allow myself to be caught up in competing with my colleagues that results in envy and contempt between us. Therefore, most of the time I allow myself to be led astray from my ultimate goal of achieving happiness through altruistic work. Thus, I always remind myself each day that the reason I keep moving forward in life is to help more people or benefit the lives of many communities from today and then tomorrow. I can still recall this moment in my life, which I actually discussed in one of my essays in this class, about my desire to help the street dwellers that I come across living and sleeping in the streets of Cebu City. I don't really know whether they are drug addicts or just regular beggars, but regardless, although I cannot really uplift them from their situation, I contemplated on helping them in some way, like at least provide them money or food. Unfortunately, I surrendered to my fears. I imagined that if I gave them money, they would take advantage of me when I come across them again in the future. Moreover, I also imagine that there may be ordinances in Cebu City prohibiting street dwellers to request money from people. Moreover, I also recall this moment in my life when I attempted to interact with this old lady that has a mental illness and living on the streets here in my province in southern Leyte. I usually encountered her when I go to school, but I never interacted with her out of fear. However, one day, when I was sitting on a bench and was waiting for a ride to take me home from school, I met her and she sat next to me. Initially, I was afraid of her because of her appearance, but then after a few minutes, I attempted to initiate a conversation with her. Unfortunately, the old lady just ignored me and got out of the bench and then walked away. At the end of the day, I always attempt to see the good in people, especially the poor and marginalized, and find what makes me equal with them despite their circumstances. Unfortunately, most of the time I always gave in to fears, thus not putting my ideas into motion. So, in conclusion, my personal notion of happiness is about its achievement through charitable work, especially to the poor and the marginalized. A person's competitiveness and drive for immediate gratification are not inherently evil and can become means to benefit the lives of other people. My personal notion of happiness reflects Catholic moral theology because it is concerned with avoiding evil, making morally sound judgment, and following the teachings of Christ the suffering servant. That is all, everyone. I hope that you learned something new about Catholicism in this video, and I wish for you guys the best in the future. See you!